still plenty of people who are in favor of capital punishment. As of 2022, 55% of Americans surveyed in a Gallup poll supported the death penalty.
There are many people within society who continue to advocate that the death penalty is necessary to exact retribution or justice, but the death penalty has never been about justice. It is about retribution, it's about vengeance, and some of our ugliest societal impulses and urges. But the death penalty's history tells no lies. It is a history of racial animus. It is a history of arbitrary application. It is a history of executing the most vulnerable people within society. And the death penalty remains as inhumane as it ever has been.
The US is one of the few democratic nations that still uses capital punishment. In fact, more than 70% of the world's nations have gotten rid of the death penalty. It's time Americans ask themselves, do we want to be a country that allows the government to arbitrarily decide who gets to live and who gets to die?
This is one of the most insufferable videos I have ever watched. It is truly amazing how someone can so arrogantly and smugly get so much wrong. To say that the death penalty has never been about justice is the opposite of the truth, because the primary argument for the death penalty is that it is justice. That argument is far more important than the deterrence argument or the closure to victims or any other argument. The main reason we support the death penalty is because of justice. The idea that mass murderers get to eat 3 meals a day, have access to medical care, and hot showers is repulsive. They should have nothing. They should be in the hellfire because that is justice. And those against the death penalty are delaying justice and giving benefits to the scum of the earth. Let's unpack some of the nonsensical claims made in the video.
There are many people within society who continue to advocate that the death penalty is necessary to exact retribution or justice, but the death penalty has never been about justice. It is about retribution, it's about vengeance, and some of our ugliest societal impulses and urges.
This guy is blatantly spreading misinformation about what death penalty proponents are saying. Not only is he strawmanning what the death penalty is really about, he is doing it with such a holier-than-thou attitude, which is almost worse than the misinformation. To say that the death penalty has never been about justice is one of the most outrageous misrepresentations of an opposing worldview ever given. Virtually every time the death penalty is promoted, justice is at the heart of the discussion. Other factors are also spoken of by proponents, including deterrence, but justice is almost always mentioned. You can disagree that it is just, but you do not get to deny facts. He also says the death penalty is about retribution, like it's a bad thing. Yes, it is partially about retribution, and that's what we want. Retribution can be a good thing. The idea that vengeance or retribution or revenge are always wrong is ridiculous, and there is no basis for it. It's just something people say and believe without questioning it. Here are 3 great quotes from Charles K.B. Barton, who wrote on this in his book, Getting Even: Revenge as a Form of Justice, published in 1999. Perhaps the greatest obstacle in the path of substantial victim empowerment is the fear of revenge, as evidenced by revenge's undeservedly poor image. Especially in contemporary Western societies, revenge is widely thought of as being crazy, nasty, and unworthy of the aspirations of truly civilized people or of a civilized society. Wanting revenge is frowned upon and is treated with distrust, no matter how badly or unfairly the victim might have been treated and harmed by the wrongdoer. Reinforced by stiff legal sanctions, our present public morality's condemnation of revenge seems so powerful and complete that any admissions to feelings of revengefulness and resentment would be met with distrust and disapproval. Seeking justice is all very well, but it is far from acceptable for anyone to admit that the justice they claim to seek may in fact add up to revenge. There seems to be a curious ambivalence in attitudes toward revenge in our culture. Notwithstanding the severity with which revenge is condemned, there appears to be no end to people's fascination and preoccupation with revenge in both fiction and reality. The impulse to get even in the face of injustice is one of the most enduring aspects of the human spirit, which even the stiffest penalties can only hope to dampen, but never completely eradicate. And, while wanting justice is openly acceptable, the false distinction between revenge and justice breaks down even in the courtroom when judges and juries cannot in good conscience deny or disregard the presence of fundamental and legitimate motives for justice behind what are clear acts of revenge. Leaving aside the questionable assumption of superiority in such thinking, it represents a costly delusion, the burden of which is borne mostly by victims of crime. The silencing, disempowerment, and severe marginalization of victims in our criminal justice proceedings owe a lot to such views about revenge, and to the corresponding official attitudes towards victims who may be all too easily suspected and accused of being motivated by revenge. Even historically, the process of victim disempowerment started with a desire by rulers and governments to control feuds and revenge killings, and to be sure, few of us would wish to bring back those practices. However, we have gone too far in our ostracism of revenge when a victim's evidence can be challenged and discredited in our courtrooms with such glib phrases as, "You only want revenge, don't you?" As if revenge and justice were incompatible, or had nothing in common, and as if wanting revenge were a most terrible thing, something to be ashamed of. In response to such techniques designed to silence them, victims usually try to maintain their credibility by denying the accusation, insisting that they only want justice. However, by doing this they have been put on the back foot, because revenge is personal retribution, and in calling for justice, victims typically want the fair, but nevertheless retributive punishment of those who unjustly harmed them. Thus, both personal and retributive elements being present in a victim's desire for justice, that desire does in fact amount to a desire for revenge. This, I maintain, is a necessary truth, denials of which are likely to be suspect even to the philosophically untrained. Maintaining credibility for victims by way of protestations that they only want justice, not revenge, is not really convincing to their audience in court, nor even to themselves. The accusation sticks because there is truth in it, and victims suffer more trauma as their motives are questioned. But victims should never have to justify themselves in this fashion. While retribution may not always be among a victim's reasons for wanting punishment, in those cases where they call for fair punishment on retributive grounds, their calls are equally legitimate and justified. For to repeat an earlier point, once there is no personal involvement left in the process of punishment, it is no longer appropriate to talk about revenge. If the personal element were retained through this process of institutionalization, if the victims and their relatives retained their involvement, if they had a say or a hand in the punishment of their wrongdoers, the imposed punishment would quite appropriately be called institutionalized or sanitized revenge. But where all personal involvement of this nature is excluded, and the institution takes the retribution completely out of the hands of the victims concerned, it is most inappropriate to regard such punishment as still revenge.
Penalty has never been about justice. It is about retribution, it's about vengeance, and some of our ugliest societal impulses and urges. But the death penalty's history tells no lies. It is a history of racial animus.
So are other institutions, including higher education and the medical industry, which both have a history of mistreating black people. Does that mean these should be abolished? Maybe some universities should be, but not for the reason of historic racism. And if racism is still a problem, I am happy to say that only some white murderers can receive the death penalty. No black people will receive the penalty, okay? That solves the race issue right there. This is definitely an unpopular opinion, but I really do believe the death penalty is about justice, and some justice is better than less justice.
It is a history of arbitrary application.
I will say it hasn't been arbitrary for decades. People are generally arrested because there is some evidence they committed the crime. A case is built against them using forensics, camera footage, witnesses, documentation, and more. None of that is arbitrary. The rules of evidence are complicated and robust in order to avoid a miscarriage of justice. The standard of proof is beyond reasonable doubt. When someone is sentenced to death in modern courts, it is far from arbitrary. Arbitrary practices of the past do not justify modern abolition.
It is a history of executing the most vulnerable people within society.
Executing the most vulnerable? How are murderers and rapists the most vulnerable people? Because those are the people most likely to be executed. Calling these sick scum vulnerable is despicable. The fact that the death penalty has been misapplied does not mean the majority of court-directed executions were illegitimate.
And the death penalty remains as inhumane as it ever has been.
What is inhumane is giving life, food, water, showers, medical care, and phone calls to the most evil people imaginable while their victims rot in the ground. The death penalty has been practiced by most civilizations throughout history. It is a very human and humane thing. If you want to have compassion for anyone, have it for the victims of the crime, not the monsters that perpetrate it. Show them no pity.
The US is one of the few democratic nations that still uses capital punishment. In fact, more than 70% of the world's nations have gotten rid of the death penalty. It's time Americans ask themselves, do we want to be a country that allows the government to arbitrarily decide who gets to live and who gets to die?
This is proof that stupid questions really do exist. Was it arbitrary when Adolf Eichmann, may he perish in hell, was executed? As one of the chief architects of the Holocaust, he bears the blood of millions. We cannot even comprehend such a number of people. Should he have lived until his old age living in reasonable and humane conditions, eating 3 meals a day with a shower and access to books? How about John Wayne Gacy, who lured, raped, and murdered 33 young men and boys, burying many of them beneath his house? Should he have been allowed to continue breathing, living life behind bars, while his victims lie cold in the ground? How about Timothy McVeigh, the domestic terrorist who murdered 168 innocent people, including 19 children, in the Oklahoma City bombing? Should he have been given the privilege of life, reflecting on his cause in the comfort of a cell, while families mourned their loved ones? How about Ted Bundy, who manipulated, tortured, and brutally murdered dozens of young women, leaving a trail of unimaginable grief and horror? Should he have been allowed to live in a cell with protection of the prison guards who must ensure his safety and well-being? The anti-death penalty crowd claims to be humane and civilized when in reality, they are the moral cowards who are protecting the lives of the most evil people on earth. They are on the side that says Bundy and McVeigh should have lived in humane conditions behind bars and died of old age, and that Hitler should have lived if he were captured alive. These are the people who say that Gacy should have died peacefully of old age. These are the people who say that Osama bin Laden, if he was captured, should have been treated humanely and died of old age, and they claim to be the moral ones while giving life to the enemies of mankind.